So if the Department of Justice obtains something through a grand jury subpoena, they can't share that information or those documents with the SEC. The SEC doesn't sort of have really the sharing issues that the department does.
Welcome to the Hughes Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Investigation Practice Group's podcast, All Things Investigations. The Hughes Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Investigation Practices Group represents many of the premier companies around the world, providing advice on issues spanning the full anti-corruption and compliance spectrum. In this podcast, host Tom Fox and members of the Hughes Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Practice Group will highlight some of the key legal issues involved in white-collar and other investigations, both domestically and internationally. We will tackle topical issues involved in investigations, as well as explore how companies can prevent and detect issues that arise in conducting investigations on a worldwide basis. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode of the award-winning All Things Investigations. Today, I'm thrilled to have back with me Laura Perkins. Laura, first of all, welcome back, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Laura, I think all compliance practitioners have heard of the FCPA unit, but I've wanted for some time to sit down and visit with you about what is the FCPA unit, how does it fit within the fraud section, and how does it fit within the Department of Justice? I know that's something you have intimate experience with. So could you tell us what the FCPA unit is, why it's in Main Justice, and what does it do?
Sure. Structurally, I'll just give you kind of a high-level overview. So the criminal division of the Department of Justice, they fit obviously within the Department of Justice. And then within that, it has a number of different sections. The fraud section is one of the sections in the criminal division. And within the fraud section has 3 litigating units. It has a couple of other units. And I know, Tom, we're going to touch on one of those a little bit later, which is the corporate enforcement compliance policy unit. But the 3 main litigating units within the fraud section are the FCPA unit, the healthcare fraud unit, and the market integrity and major frauds unit. Each of those units handles ongoing cases and investigations within sort of the space that their name suggests they would. So the FCPA unit prosecutors and supervisors handle investigations and cases involving Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or potential Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations. So that's sort of where it fits within the fraud section. And it has historically been in the fraud section and sort of only in the fraud section, as opposed to within different U.S. attorneys' offices, because FCPA violations are a difficult thing to investigate. They require specialized knowledge how to handle cross-border matters. And so when the FCPA first started to be enforced, it was placed within the criminal division and the fraud section specifically to ensure that prosecutors who were handling those cases had that specialized knowledge to move those cases forward.
We recently had a departure, the head of the FCPA unit, the announcement of an acting head. What is the head of the FCPA unit?
So the chief of the unit is the individual who is within the unit, sort of the end of the reporting structure. So there are certain things within, as you'd expect, I mean, those of you who are at companies are used to sort of bureaucracy. The Department of Justice is no different, probably even more sort of bureaucracy. And so within the FCPA unit, there are line prosecutors, and those are called trial attorneys. And then there is sort of the first line supervisor, which is an assistant chief. And then there is the chief level. Although I think now, when I was there was no sort of intermediary. There was assistant chief and then the chief. Now I think there is, in fact, assistant chief, I think it's principal deputy chief, and then chief of the FCPA unit. And that individual oversees all of the cases within the FCPA unit and handles a lot of the sort of next level reporting. So meets on a regular basis with the chief of the fraud section and the principal deputy chief and others to report on the most important matters that the FCPA unit is handling.
Do the trial attorneys, as you have named them, do they report to the acting head or the principal acting head?
So different matters get handled differently given the movement of individuals within the unit. And I say that because, for example, if a case was being handled by, let's say, David Pure, who's the new chief, if he was supervising that matter as an assistant chief and then in his new role, he would probably keep primary supervision of that going forward. So it really depends. But typically, trial attorneys will report on sort of a first level basis to the assistant chief that is over either that individual or that case in particular. And then the assistant chief will handle the direct reporting to the chief.
What's the relationship of the chief to the head of the fraud section?
There are frequent meetings between the chiefs of the various units and the chief of the fraud section. I'm not sure sort of what the interval is now. When I was there, on occasion it was weekly, on occasion it was biweekly. So I'm not sure how Glenn Leon, the new chief of the fraud section, if he's having weekly meetings with each unit chief. Typically it was with the unit chief and the assistant chiefs would meet with the chief of the fraud section. When I was there, again, it was on a weekly basis to talk about any issues that are arising in any cases. If even higher level Department of Justice management is interested in understanding things about particular cases, the chief would field those requests on a first basis and then discuss with the chief, the assistant chief, or the relevant trial attorney.
Who does the head of the fraud section report to, Laura?
Technically, the Deputy Assistant Attorney General who is over the fraud section. And right now that is Lisa Miller, who was previously in the fraud section. And she is the Deputy Assistant Attorney General over the fraud section. So the fraud section will submit to the Assistant Attorney General's office on a weekly basis case summaries and updates on important things that are happening within the fraud section. And we'll have meetings with both the DAG, which is the Deputy Assistant Attorney General, and the AAG on at least a monthly basis to discuss the ongoing cases.
Laura, it would seem to me that FCPA cases by their very nature involve conduct outside the United States, so it may impact other U.S. agencies from IRS to the State Department to perhaps many others. How does the trial attorney or the line prosecutor interact with other U.S. agencies to make sure everyone's interests are protected?
Yeah. As far as other agencies, often the fraud section is working with U.S. attorneys' offices. So there may be that office is already involved in the actual investigation and prosecution. With regard to investigating agencies like IRS or the FBI, again, they may be involved in the actual investigation. So that interaction is fairly frequent and fluid. Agencies like the Department of State, typically the fraud section will get them involved if necessary, but there isn't a huge overlap in sort of the discussions of ongoing law enforcement investigations with outside agents.
And how about the relationship of the Department of Justice FCPA unit with the SEC's FCPA unit?
That is a very close relationship, and often cases are worked in parallel, not necessarily jointly, because there are potential discovery issues that can be created if it's a joint investigation. And so the department and the SEC typically try to work in parallel, which will mean that if there's an investigation into a corporation and the company is coming in and briefing prosecutors and SEC attorneys on their investigation, what they're seeing, often those meetings will be held with both DOJ prosecutors and SEC attorneys at the same time, all in the same room, just for efficiency's sake, so that the company doesn't have to go brief the prosecutors and then brief the SEC. But then when those meetings are done, there is some coordination between SEC and DOJ over investigative steps, but not 100% sort of coordination because there are grand jury issues on the Department of Justice's side. So if the Department of Justice obtains something through a grand jury subpoena, They can't share that information or those documents with the SEC. The SEC doesn't sort of have really the sharing issues that the department does, but those are some of the reasons why they're somewhat coordinated, but not really completely the same investigations.
Well, how does the FCPA unit report up on major cases? How high up would a decision on a resolution, a potential monitorship, or just a significant issue go up within the department itself?
There's formal reporting, and then there's sort of responses as well. I spent about a year in the Office of the Assistant Attorney General and would see sort of the incoming reports, both from the fraud section as well as the other sections within the criminal division. And on a weekly basis, they submit a written update to the AAG on major case developments. So there will be both that written update, and then they will have weekly or monthly or biweekly meetings with both the DAG and the AAG. So that reporting can come up in that way. It can also come up if there are policy issues that are involved or potentially touching on an investigation that might not otherwise be a very large investigation that's followed more frequently. Or on occasion, the AAG's office will receive requests from Congress with regard to certain investigations that may not even really been on their radar screen, or other countries may reach out and have issues or want to have discussions. So there's a very fluid communication and open line of communication between the front office of the criminal division, which is what the Assistant Attorney General's office is referred to. So the front office and the leadership of the fraud section.
Or earlier you mentioned another unit in the fraud section, if that's the right term, corporate enforcement, compliance and policy unit. It seems to me that this is one that may actually impact the compliance professional more on a day-to-day basis because of information released. Most recently, the 2023 evaluation of corporate compliance programs. We're in the second edition of the FCPA resource guide. Could you say a little bit about what that unit does?
Sure. That unit, given its name, you would expect that they do have a major role in assisting prosecutors in evaluating corporate compliance programs, as well as overseeing any compliance monitors that are put in place. They also have a large role in helping to select the compliance monitors that are chosen. In addition to sort of that role, they also have a role in working with the section as a whole on policy developments, both from the compliance perspective as well as sort of criminal corporate enforcement more generally. And that role is both within the fraud section as well as helping work on any department-wide initiatives there might be from a corporate criminal law perspective. They also do some things that don't really hit sort of the press as much. They handle FOIA requests that come into the fraud section. They also handle crime victim issues that may arise. And what they are part of the group that the FCPA unit and fraud section send over to the OECD to work with the working group on bribery.
Laura, this has really been just a fascinating explanation. As I said, I've wanted to do this with you for some time. I want to thank you for sharing, and I look forward to continuing our conversation.
Thank you very much.